Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening from wherever you are. Thank you for joining us on episode 6 for Voices for Excellence. I am the CEO as well as founder, Dr. Michael T. Connor, and thank you for joining us. And today's guest, I just made a personal call, right? Because before I became a superintendent, right? And this was when I was an assistant superintendent of teaching and learning. And then the next level was the chief academic officer. I used to follow this superintendent, right? Because she was making headways across the country. And when you seek best practices or even seek promise and practices, you try to find those leaders that are doing it in the field. So I've known Dr. Susan Enfield for when she was a superintendent and I was a chief academic officer. And then the work, when I became superintendent, the work that she was doing in Washington State was another emulation of what I was trying to do in my district, specifically around strategic planning and that operational lens with data. And now personally, she became a good friend. We served on some panels together, attended some conferences, still got to, talk to her in person and pick her brain. And essentially she knows when she sees me, she runs the other side because she knows I'm going to geek out with her. So it is awesome to have Dr. Susan Enfield on episode 6 for Voices for Excellence. Susan, thank you so much for agreeing to come on.
Hello, Michael, my friend. And there are people around that I would run the other way when I see them. You are not one, my friend.
Thank you, Susan. Now, full transparency, right? And this is going to be a tongue twister, right? So I'm calling it from the outset. So please correct me, interject rudely and respectfully when I chop this up. But Susan, you are the superintendent of Washoe County School District in Reno, Nevada.
Nevada.
Did I get it right? No? Yeah,
pretty close. You learn very quickly when you come to the great state of Nevada that it is Nevada, not Nevada. And I feel that I am constantly doing public service announcements to my friends and colleagues outside of Nevada to make sure that when they come visit, they pronounce it correctly, because my fellow Nevadans do take it quite seriously.
And that's why I'm not going to say the W word or the N word anymore for the rest of the show.
That's probably a wise move.
But it's so good to have you on here. So really, let's just now dig into the questions, because, of course, I want this to be not only a podcast that people attend, but that they use this in an asynchronous context so that they're learned from this and to really engage and learn from the best leaders across the country. But this is kind of like a loose question, right? The first question is, we know you're a revered and well-respected superintendent in this country, right? But when I see Dr. Susan Enfield, or you have people participating in conferences that are hearing you for the first time, or even, could be your deputy superintendent or practitioners that are in the classroom level, what is the equity song that defines you? When Susan Enfield walks into a room, I'm thinking of X when I see her in preparation to lead a cabinet meeting or speak on a really good topic across the country?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Michael. So I think what first comes to mind and what makes it a little bit challenging is I'm going to reference something that, came to define our work in Highline, but that it has really become my personal mantra. And I think that people do associate it with me. And you're familiar with the fact that in Highline, where I became superintendent in 2012, we developed our Highline Promise. And that promise is to know every student by name, strength, and need, so they graduate prepared for the future they choose. And that promise truly became the DNA of our system, and was really, we grounded everything we did, every decision we made, from teaching and learning to operations, in that promise. And I've got to be honest with you, I think it's perhaps the best definition for equity that I can think of, because if we unpack it, if we say to ourselves, and by the way, this promise stems from my work as a high school English teacher, where I promised my students I would know all of their first names by the end of the first week of school. I think that knowing someone's name is the most basic form of respect, that I would know what they needed. But what Highline taught me is that as important as it is to know what our students need, we need to know what they are good at. What are their strengths? How do we celebrate their assets? So if we unpack that promise, let's think to ourselves. So if every student in our schools across this country were known by name, a name pronounced correctly with respect and affection, by strength, that they knew, that we knew what assets, the many assets that they bring each and every day to school, and we help capitalize on them and grow their confidence. By need, whether that's academic, social, emotional, that we know them by name, strength, and need, so that we are preparing them to graduate prepared for the future they choose, not a future that is predestined for them because of a lack of access to opportunity, because of adult belief systems that limit them in any way. If we could say that we were delivering on that promise for every child in our schools, we would no longer be having debates and conversations around equity. We would have truly equitable school systems.
No, I agree with that. And, when I think of, right, and what, not even just a song, but this initiative with the Highline Promise, right? And when I think of that, and I remember and following your work when that promise was being implemented. And one of the things where I was getting dissonance at, right? And this is just for me because I wanted to adopt a continuous improvement strategy that has the stems of the Highline Promise. I'm like, wow, how am I going to be able to create vertical and horizontal coherence with regards to the staff aligning to this Highline Promise, or, the frames of it? As a superintendent that wants to embark upon this, right? I didn't have access to a Susan Enfield, or maybe I was scared to email a Dr. Susan Enfield a question like that. But now, right, having you on the podcast and using that as a continuous improvement strategy, where would I start so that an initiative of this magnitude really lament and concretize equity in my organization?
I love that you use the word concretize, because I use it too. And I actually think it's a made up word, but I love it. So I'm glad that I'm not the only one. So bravo. I feel quite validated right now. So I think that's a great question, Michael. And what I will say, I will start by saying this. So we developed that promise in 2012. And in the ensuing years, over the decade that I was fortunate enough to serve as the superintendent for Highline Public Schools, districts across the country started adopting the promise. And, someone said to me, are you going to trademark it? Are you going to? And I said, no, because that's not what we're about in public education, right? I mean, I think that you've alluded to it. We are all in this for the same reason. And frankly, the fact that my team and I in Highline were able to put into words something that resonates so broadly and so deeply around the country, if we think about it, that should be our national promise. Absolutely. Right? That should be our national promise as educators to our children. And so I love the fact that it has taken flight and that others around the country use it. And I will tell you, when it really drove home to me that it had really taken root in our culture in Highline was when families and staff and students sometimes would use it against us at a board meeting. And I remember the first time it happened, and someone got up in public comment and said, that's not knowing every student by name, strength, and need. And I remembered afterwards, I was really rattled. And my communications person, Catherine Carboni Rogers, who was just terrific, she said, no, this is good. It's good. I mean, it means that we are so clear. People talk about what's your why, right? Mm-hmm. So people were so clear in what we stood for and what we were publicly committing to that they were going to hold us accountable to it. And that is a good thing. Now, it's a tough thing, right? Mm-hmm. It's tough to hear when you're not delivering on it. But as leaders, we need to hear what we need to hear, not what we want to hear. And so what I will say, the example I will give is how we, for lack of a better term, operationalized the promise. Mm-hmm. And there are things that I learned that I would do differently. And I think as we embark here in Washoe County on our strategic planning process in January, it'll be interesting to see how I could apply some of those lessons learned. But one of the things that we did, particularly during the pandemic, when we had to do so many webinars and presentations to staff and families on social distancing and masking and things that had nothing to do with teaching and learning. Correct. It did not matter what the topic was of any presentation or conversation, we started every presentation with that promise.
Absolutely. And you know what?
We always grounded ourselves in that. And Meredith Honig, who's a professor at the University of Washington and a good friend of mine, and the leading researcher really on how do you create a central office that truly supports equitable schools, equitable teaching and learning. You know, she actually is the one who said, it's really the DNA of your system. So that really became our DNA, and it defined who we were and how we made decisions. And we had hard conversations in cabinet meetings where you know, my team and I would challenge one another. Is this decision truly an equitable one? If we unpack it. And so I think that it forced us to ask hard questions, to have hard conversations, but it also gave us the gift of being so clear in why we did everything we did as a school system. And that was wonderful.
And Dr. Enfield, this is the reason why I got you on the podcast selfishly, because what our audience need to know is how much of a staunch equity warrior that you are, right? And really not afraid to ask some of the hard questions that allies are afraid to ask. You put it out there, and that's what's great about you. That's what makes you so sensational, is because of your equity lens. But we're going to get into that. And I said this from the outset, you know, and you heard me say this many times. If there's a superintendent in the United States of America that I want my son under her leadership, it is Dr. Enfield. Right. I said
Michael,
that.
That's probably the kindest thing anyone said to me.
You know, I said that to you a while ago. I was like, listen, if I can't educate Mikey, well, Susan, you're going to take him. But I tell you, Washoe, I can't wait to see the second iteration. I don't even want to call the Washoe Promise, but the Highline Promise 2.0 and what that's going to look like. And in your district. But moving on, right? And I think this is where we really connected. Our whole brain, how we're wired around the D and the A word, data and analytics. And you know that the question was going to come up, Dr. Enfield, with that. But from a systems disruption lens, right? Because we know that now in the AC stage of education, I call it after COVID, in my book, after COVID, COVID-19, when you think about it, we have to, the theory of action or the value proposition, education, business, however you want to contextualize it, is we have to disrupt the system, but we have to do it in a much intentional manner, borrowing from different industries and different practices, whether it be business sciences or business science, computer science, to be able to integrate into education. It has to have that level of strategic disruption. But building capacity around that, specifically when you talk about now really using data as an agile principle for transformation. But what's very difficult is how you build vertical and horizontal capacity with that. But what I saw you when you were in Highline, right, that was evident. Central office talked like you, or talked like, I should say, the strategic plan, right? Highline Promise wasn't another accountability measure, but you use data. Site-based administrators knew every single kid, strength, name, need. Are you kidding me? That's equity right there on an individual level. But an instructional lens as well, you saw the vertical and the horizontal articulation. That is a massive and arduous underdoing, specifically when you look at innovation, equity, and excellence from a data and analytic lens. But how would you now, you're prepared, Dr. Enfield, for the AC stage of education, but how would you, or what strategies would you provide other leaders to prepare for that level of disruption, but have data as a rooted practice for strategic or pedagogical change?
Yeah, there's a lot in that question.
Well, you know how I am, Susan.
So when you're talking about disruption, when you're talking about transformation, when you're talking about change, improvement, whatever words you want to use, especially at the outset, data is your friend. You know, as a new leader coming in. So the example that I'll give that I know you're familiar with, when I arrived in Highline in 2012, and I was an English teacher, so I use words and language very deliberately. And when I arrived in Highline in 2012, we were hemorrhaging children. And I use that term hemorrhaging very deliberately. Our out of school suspension and expulsion numbers were unconscionably high. And I think in a district of, 19,000 students, we had out of school suspended or expelled well over 2,000 times the year before I arrived. And, not surprising to you or to me, the vast majority of the students that we were pushing out of school did not look like me. And so it was our students of color, for the most part, that were being pushed out of school. And as a high school teacher, I've never believed that out of school suspension and expulsion is an effective strategy to help a child learn from their mistakes. Now, it is a necessary mechanism when a student is truly a harm to themselves or someone else. I want to be clear. There are sadly legitimate reasons where we have to remove a child from school temporarily. That's just a fact. Breaks my heart, but it's a fact. And I think that for us to talk in false platitudes around especially issues like this does not advance the work. We need to be honest. We need to be real. So, but when I arrived in Highline, when we looked at the data, not only was the data disproportionately impacting our students of color, the number one reason that we were pushing children out of school was for defiance. It wasn't for violent acts. It was for defiance. And, as I said to my team, you show me a teenager who's not defiant, I'll show you a walking miracle, right? That is their job. That is what they are put on the planet to do. They are going to push the boundaries and find out how far they can push. And we as the adults, we have to be the adults. And we have to turn those really tough moments into teachable moments. So, I made that data really public. And I said, look, this isn't Susan Enfield's personal crusade, though it kind of was. The data here really backs me up. We have to do something. But I also want to say something too about data here, Michael. There's the quantitative data, right? Just the sheer numbers that I could show. Broken down demographically, broken down by school. There's that just hard quantitative data, but there's also qualitative data. And I think that even though the quantitative data people can't dismiss because the numbers are what the numbers are, sometimes it's the qualitative data that can drive something home. And so in addition to putting the numbers out there and having that conversation, I decided to put a face to the issue. And so early on in my first year, we brought all of our principals and central office leaders together. And I had two young men of color, come and share their story about being suspended multiple times and what was going on in their lives and what the impact this had on them. And when they were done, staff in the room had a chance to ask them questions. And I just sat back and I listened and I listened and I waited for the one question that really needed to be asked. In my opinion, the only question that really mattered. And when no one asked it, I did. And I said, at any point during this period in your life, did any adult in your school ask you what was wrong? Did any adult in the school ask you why you were doing drugs, why you were getting into fight? Because if they had done that, Michael, they would have learned that one had lost his father recently and was struggling, right? Our children have stories, and those stories impact. They don't leave those stories and those experiences at home when they enter the classroom. And we have to be mindful to take the time and say, talk to me about what's going on. And I think that moment changed some people's minds about the need to do this work. And it is hard work. This is not work for the faint of heart. But I think you've got to find that blend of quantitative and qualitative data. And then you have to constantly revisit it and make it part of your regular data analysis practice. Make it really easy to find on your data dashboard, and talk about it. Talk about it as often as you can, because you have to build some collective will. I will argue not just with your staff in the district, but within the broader community, especially when it comes to issues like discipline.
Dr. Enfield, I mean, there's a lot to unpack, but I hope that our participants in an asynchronous manner be able to go back and listen to that answer, because transparency of data, both the utility of qualitative and quantitative data, really understanding, why we were suspending our students. And when you think about it, defiance, I mean, you contextualize the confusion versus identity theory, the trans-adolescent learner. But what I really liked was, and this goes into the next question, is, having students, empowering students, Black and brown students, to really articulate, really to tell their story. So not many superintendents, I can tell you this, not many superintendents across the country, probably domestically and internationally, does that. And Susan, you are, I considered, a trusted ally in this work. You're one of, besides my Black and brown brother and sister superintendents out there, Susan Enfield is one of the first individuals I'm calling on my team. But that's going back to Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, right? The need for awe and trusted allies to really push equity and excellence in our schools, also within the broader economic efficiencies as well. But as an ally, right? As an ally, how do you define equity? And how would you support this work? People like you that are not Black and brown, because here's the thing, right? And Susan, whether it be Burien Davis, whether it be Barbara Mullen, whether it be Tahira Chase in New York, Louvel, it doesn't matter, Marlon, it doesn't matter, right? You see these individuals pushing the work across the country, and then you got you, who is a white woman, still pushing the work that is needed. But some of our white allies are afraid to lead this. What strategies would you give them, Susan, as I say, the voice in America?
Well, this is a very, very complex issue and a complex answer, and I'm glad you raised it, because I think it's one we really do need to talk about. First of all, though, I will offer an amendment to the ally position, which my dear friend Gil Parsons, who was a principal in Highline and is now a principal supervisor, he said at one of our district gatherings years and years ago, he said, "Susan, I don't need an ally, I need an accomplice."
Ooh, that's deeper.
And so,
did they trademark it like we said in the beginning?
We're very giving in Highline. We share all of our genius with the rest of the world. But we did it. I have actually a Wordle framed up on my shelf here that was from that meeting, and the word accomplice is the biggest word in that Wordle. And what I think is, what I like about accomplice, it's sort of why I like promise versus mission or vision, right? A promise implies action. A mission or vision can be very one-dimensional. It can be a platitude. Similarly, I can be a silent ally, but if I'm an accomplice, I'm in it with you, right? I'm in the fight. I'm in the work. I'm putting myself out there. So this is what I will say. First of all, and I've had this conversation with new superintendents. The landscape right now for superintendents across this country who are committed to doing this work is fraught with minefields, as you well know, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're seeing every day colleagues who are losing their jobs and really getting put through it for doing the right thing for children. So the one caution that I will always give is when I give presentations to superintendents, and they're like, "I want to be more like you. I want to say things that," and I said, whoa. I said, I'm 10 years in, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm in my 50s now, right? So like back, in my 40s, I wasn't smart enough to know what I was really doing, right? Now I actually don't care, right? Like I'm going to do what I want to do and say what I want to say. My joke is I tell people I've got a mouth and I'm not afraid to use it. So,
Amen.
but I do think it is important that we help, especially our new superintendents or superintendents, and I will speak to this in a minute, new to their context, to their district, to build up some coalition support, right? Before they take on some of these battles publicly. Context matters. You've got to make sure that you are leading for equity, yes, in a bold, courageous way, but in a way that isn't going to get your ass fired, right? Now, there are moments where it is worth putting your ass on the line, and I'm just going to keep it real, right? But the reality is that we all can't be getting ourselves fired every other week, because that's not good for kids. We need leadership stability. So, I think it's important to recognize your local context and build up that coalition of support before you go out and boldly lead and talk about the work. And I also want to be clear, when I talk about context, I'm talking about geographical context, political context. Remember, Highline is right outside Seattle. It is in the bluest blue bubble politically that exists in this country, right? So talking about issues of race and racial equity, that was expected in that region. So I could have conversations that some of my colleagues in other parts, even probably some of my colleagues here in parts in rural Nevada, probably can't have in that way, right? And so I think that is important that we recognize that. And I don't think that that's backing down or copping out. I think it's being smart, right? Because we need to advance the work. So I think what I would say is, make sure that you've got that your local context, that you've built some support. And then again, make sure that you've surrounded yourself with a team of people who share your fire.
Absolutely.
Right? And because this is a team sport, right? I didn't do anything alone in Highline. I did it with an extraordinary team of people who taught me and made me better and advanced the work for children far more than it would have ever happened if I were doing it solo. And so, find your team. And then, I think you also have to be really clear which battles you're willing to lose and which ones you're willing to lose your job over.
Absolutely. Dr. Enfield, that is a great answer. That specifically, right? And that equity work, I really loved how you put it, the local context, geographical and political. Got to pay attention to those contexts because, we see that, some strategies, right, pertaining to how they're bringing in the DEI work, right?
Well, Michael, can I just, please. Sorry, I have to give an example because I went from the bluest of the blue to a state that's really purple/red, right? Nevada is very different. Washoe is definitely purple. It's not a bright red part, but it's more red than I'm accustomed to. And when I was first hired, I wasn't even on the job yet. So they just hired me. I'm sitting at home in Washington. The board president calls me and says, "Can we talk?" And I said, "Sure." So I haven't even been hired 2 weeks. And she said, "So we're getting lots of emails from some people in the community that are not happy because they did their digging on you. And they found this, she said article, it was a blog post that I had contributed to. And they're really, really upset. And they're saying we should, rescind your contract and, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a blog post I had contributed to for Tom Vander Ark's Getting Smart blog. And the title was Decentering Whiteness in America's Schools. Now, that I will fully admit that in many parts of this country, that is an incendiary title, right? It just is. I'm not saying it's not factual. I'm saying though in many parts of the country,
I'm pleading the fifth. I'm pleading the fifth, Dr. Enfield.
But remember, in Highline, I was expected to use language that bold, that clear, right? And when I contributed to that blog post, I also wasn't thinking about job hunting. And even if I had, I still would have done it anyway. But that's just because I'm old and ornery. And while I acknowledge that the title itself is off-putting for some people, if you read the piece, the premise was really our public education system was set up for white middle-class English-speaking students with no learning disabilities and a good support system at home.
Correct.
That is not the vast majority of children that we are serving in our public schools right now. And doesn't that warrant some deep and honest examination of the systems and structures that are endemic to K-12 public education in the United States of America? And for anybody who says that that is not a conversation we need to have, I would challenge you to look at the data that we looked at in Highline, where we had a large Somali and Ethiopian population. And a few years into my system, one of my principals said, I think we need to further disaggregate our data to say African-American, Ethiopian, Somali, et cetera.
Right.
And when we did that, the data is stark.
Absolutely.
In Highline, and I'm sure it's not unique to Highline, Michael, If you're a child born with Black skin in this country, your chances of succeeding in your country's education system are far less than a child born with Black skin elsewhere.
Absolutely.
That's a harsh reality that we have to talk about. And so, and yes, it's uncomfortable. I don't know how to talk about it artfully or skillfully, but I know we have to talk about it. And so I think that, you know, again, but that language that was fine in Highline wasn't going to be fine in Washoe. And I had to explain to people, I understand that I need to get to know my new community and how they want to talk about things. Mm-hmm. I will not, however, allow us as a community not to have those hard conversations about what our children are getting or not getting from their schools.
That is the reason why, Dr. Enfield, you would be the first person I call, because that answer right there contextualizes everything. You know, with Tom Vander Ark, right? I'm one of his Pathway Fellows for Getting Smart. And we're, you know, it is a very, and I love the group because you're right. These are the conversations that we're having nationally, specifically around the Pathway Fellows, where we're looking at exactly what you just said. The system is perfectly designed for a good Eurocentric education. Where now, right. And we don't take in consideration we're now Generation Alpha as well as Generation Z make up 48 to 50% of our student population that are Black and brown. So you have this junction between exactly what you just said, but a contrary serving population.
Mm-hmm.
That is just
true.
I mean, that's why I'm calling you, Dr. Enfield. Let's go. We're going into foxhole with this, but we're going to pick our battles. But
Michael, but can I say that? But now here, but I'm living this right now, right? I have chosen to come and lead in a new community, in a new context where the culture is very different. The conversation is very different. And yet the work is just as urgent. Our children are as desperate as ever for us to do this hard work and have these hard conversations. But I've got to figure out how to do it in a way that brings people in versus pushing them out. So, and I think that's our challenge right now. That
captures the name of my title of my book, right? Because when you think about it, intentional, local context, coalition, team, you know, identifying nuances with regards to your equity stance, but not compromising it, right? Bold, this is the work we got to do, and we got to do it. And unapologetic. You are unapologetic, Dr. Enfield. So when I think of that, right? So when we kind of underscoring that answer and question where, you know, to really get to that level, you're really going to now have to challenge the structures and systems in an innovative way. Right. And to memorialize innovation at all tiers is very hard. But to reimagine what you described was the business model or education model, the BC stage of education before COVID. But now we're in this permissionless age of the AC after COVID stage of education to disrupt intentionally that actually supports that blog that I loved and read. Right. So how do we do this from the context of innovation? Right. And what is your definition of innovation for equity or innovation leading to excellence?
That's a great question. You know, one of my dear friends and colleagues, Kim Smith, who works with the League of Innovative Schools at Digital Promise and has founded the Center for Innovation and Equity, and for inclusive innovation. Excuse me. Sorry, Kim, didn't mean to get the title wrong. You know, she has really, I think, taught me a lot about how to approach that in this space. And what I've learned from her is when you are talking about innovation or looking at a specific innovative practice or program, are you centering the students who are traditionally furthest away from educational opportunity? So not just, oh, is this a cool thing to do? Right? Ooh, this is exciting. Ooh, I want to do VR with my kids, right? Like, this is great. Okay. But are you centering the needs of the children in your system who need the most from you? And that has given me pause to stop and think about how we approach innovation here in Washoe County. Because innovating for the sake of innovating isn't good.
Exactly.
and yet we do need to, to innovate and do things differently, and find ways to engage our students and frankly our staff in new and different ways. But I think that keeping that equity at the core, but not just the term, not just the concept, but the children that your data, be it qualitative or quantitative, tells you need that innovation the most. Because if the innovation is just going to perpetuate, what the kids who are already flying high, right, can do, great, but it's got to be for all.
And Dr. Enfield, when you say or gave that definition of defining innovation, but equity at the core, but centering students furthest away from educational opportunity. Wow. Because if you even just, and this is just a complete inference, and you work deeply with Kim, but when you think about that, right, now you're not addressing symptoms within a system. You're addressing the root cause. And that is deep, right? And going back to one of your answers from before is that when you get to the core, you have to have that level of intentionality to have those hard conversations.
Yeah.
So now innovation is bringing in those hard conversations around equity because it's at the core of the design. So now
that's the work Kim is leading, which is why I admire her so much.
It's phenomenal, because I hope a lot of people take that definition, right? It's not, and one of the broad misnomers or macro misnomers about innovation that, you constantly have to remind people is not, hey, I want to identify this cool solution set, or, hey, we can implement the metaverse into, one of our standardized curriculums. Yeah, that's great, right? But just like you said, Johnny, who's at the 90th percentile, he's going to get to the 99th percentile because of that. But equity at the core, now you're looking at innovation and solutions fundamentally different. But last question, Dr. Enfield.
Okay.
And this is the only time I'm ever going to hold you to a word limit. 3 words. Only time I will ever hold you to a word limit. 3 words. What are the 3 words do you want today's audience and participants, continuous learners, adult learners that are challenging the system that you want them to? What 3 words do you want to leave with them regarding excellence, equity, and transforming your organizations to be more culturally relevant and innovative?
Well, so as someone whose 5th grade report card described her as chatty and afraid of the ball, both of which are still true. 3 words is definitely a challenge for me, my friend, but I will do my best. I think the 3 words or takeaway that I would want people to leave here with is purpose, power, and relationships.
Yes.
And can I do I get to give any kind of explanation for that, or no?
Anytime. You're about to say qualitative. Anytime. Can I give a qualitative explanation? Yeah. Well, 1 sentence, right?
Okay.
Go ahead, Dr. Enfield.
So obviously, so when I say purpose, you've got to know your own personal purpose, and then you've got to build a coalition to share that purpose and move it forward with you, right? Grounded in doing what's best for all children. Power, not power for power's sake, but the power to effect change in children's lives. And how do you strategically harness that power for good? And finally, relationships. You are not alone. And I want to leave people here, Michael, with this notion that, when I got that call from my new board president back in April, that, I was in trouble, not even on the job yet. I played it real cool with her on the phone, but I hung up and I thought, this isn't good. And I immediately picked up the phone and called a colleague to help me. And so I think it's important that we know that we don't have to figure this out by ourselves. reach out, right? Email, call, because we're all in this together. It's a team sport.
Absolutely. And Dr. Enfield, you are a sister soup. I still consider myself a soup. I don't care what anybody says.
As you should. I'll be your sister soup for life, Michael.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about and Richard, right, he said he has one more in him. So I'm officially telling you, I'm not telling you the timeline. I got one more in me, right? So, but I'm really loving the work that I'm doing now, and Susan, from a personal friend aspect, I want to thank you. Day one, October 2021, you were there. You made that call. When you say reach out, you are not alone. Dr. Enfield, she's not just saying that, she actually means it, because October, November, December, January 2022, all the way up until now, Dr. Susan Enfield has been there for me. So, Susan, thank you so much. It has been an absolute tremendous honor to have you on Voices for Excellence. Man, I'm telling you, I hope everybody in America listened to this episode, because there are so many nuggets that you gave to everybody, and you are not alone. I want to leave that with them, because you made that point clear, not in theory, but in practice as well.
Thank you, my friend. I hope you and Mikey have a great holiday. And hey, I'm bringing my book the next time I see you, because I need it signed. Okay, so I'm waiting for I'll bring my copy, and you got to sign it.
I got you, sis. All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Onward and upward. Have a great holiday season. We'll see you soon.